The knock came just after noon, when the lake mirrored the pale sky, its frozen skin glittering like glass under the sun. The birch trees at the edge of the yard stood bare, tall, and watchful, as though they knew what was about to unfold. I opened the door, and there was my father, Malcolm, standing tall on the porch with a strange pride in his posture, as if he had brought me salvation instead of ruin. His once calloused hands that had pulled lobster traps and mended nets on Penobscot Bay for decades, now trembled faintly as he reached into his coat. He stepped inside, his cologne sharp and suffocating in the warm air of my kitchen. With a flourish, he pulled out an envelope and placed it on the table like an offering. A neat cashier's check slid out, its typeface crisp and sterile. $12,000. There, Malcolm said, lowering himself into the chair across from me. Enough for you to start over. You can leave this place behind. Find yourself a new life in Portland, maybe even Boston. The cottage is gone now. A cash offer. $3 million. Smartest thing to do, really. I kept my eyes on the check, my fingers absently tracing the steel key I wore around my neck. It was the only relic of the cottage I'd never let go of, the weight of it grounding me like an anchor in a storm. You sold the cottage, I said, my voice steady, though my chest burned. You've been drowning in responsibility, Malcolm replied quickly, his tone dressed in false reason. Working yourself to the bone, running up and down the coast, patching this place together like some martyr. I saved you from yourself. This way, you're free. I let him talk, words spilling out like oil over calm water. He mistook my silence for surrender, a smug smile curling on his lips. He spoke of investments, of renovations, of how generous it was to hand me a check rather than leave me with nothing. What he didn't know was that I had already sat in Attorney Dana Whitlock's office 3 days earlier, signing papers that transferred the cottage into an irrevocable trust. What he didn't know was that a fraud alert already waited at the Knox County Registry of Deeds, ready to trip the moment he tried to force his scheme into motion. I picked up the check, turned it slowly in my hand, then set it back down with deliberate calm. Malcolm leaned back, convinced he had already won, the victor in a battle I hadn't even agreed to fight. I rose from my chair and walked to the frost-fogged window. The lake stretched silent and endless beyond the glass, the pine trees unmoved by his betrayal. I let myself breathe deeply, gathering the composure that had carried me through storms much harsher than this one. When I turned back, I smiled. And that was the moment Malcolm should have realized he had stepped into a story that had already been written by someone else, one in which his role was no longer author, but fool. After Malcolm left that afternoon, the cottage fell into the kind of silence that does not comfort. It presses down, heavy, as if the walls themselves hold their breath. The cheque still lay on the kitchen table where he'd placed it, a pale slip of paper that seemed to mock every winter I had endured here. I sat staring at it, my mind carrying me back through the years, to the moment the cottage first became mine. I was 24 when my mother died, old enough to know the hollow shape of grief, too young to understand how permanent it would feel. The probate judge in Rockland signed the papers that passed the cottage to me. What should have been an inheritance felt like a sentence. The house was crumbling, the roof sagging, the walls bleeding dampness through swollen boards. And yet, I stayed. Someone had to. By day, I worked jobs in Camden, waitressing, double shifts, cleaning rental properties when the tourists came and left. By night, I stripped wallpaper until my fingers blistered, hammered new joists into place, and sanded floorboards until my arms throbbed. Each nail, each repaired beam was a conversation with my mother, words unspoken but understood. I could not abandon that dialogue, not when the house was all I had left of her. But even as I fought to preserve what was hers, Malcolm drained me piece by piece. His calls came steady. a truck repair, a late mortgage payment on a house in Belfast. He swore he could flip. Some investment that would surely pay off if only I fronted the money. I said yes too often. At first, I told myself it was duty, that he was my father and I couldn't leave him to ruin. But deep down, I believed something darker. That if I held the purse strings, if I kept control, I could contain the chaos he carried with him. Control, though, comes at a price. Each dollar I gave him stole another fragment of my silence. Silence where I didn't ask questions I didn't want answered. Silence where I pretended he might change. I became the wall he leaned against while the weight bent me nearly to breaking. And through it all, the cottage never betrayed me. Its bones groaned, its windows rattled against winter winds, but it never lied. Every winter I stoked the wood stove, watched the snow pile against the stone steps, and reminded myself, this house is proof I can endure. But endurance is not the same as freedom. I learned that one night when my cousin Lucas called me. His voice trembled with the kind of unease people carry when they wish they didn't have to speak. He'd been at a marina bar in Rockport, half listening to chatter over cheap whiskey, when Malcolm's voice cut through. My father had been bragging, loud enough for strangers to hear, loud enough to taste victory before it was his. He told anyone who'd listened that the cottage would be sold within the week, that money was as good as in his pocket. Lucas hesitated before adding the part that made my chest tighten. Malcolm laughed as he explained how naive I was, how easy it was to slip a signature beneath my hand without me noticing. That laughter, even secondhand, cut like a blade. By the time Lucas hung up, my decision was already made. I would not endure this betrayal. I would fight. The next morning, I drove through the icy streets of Rockland, the kind where the ocean wind slips through your coat and gnaws at your bones. My tyres crunched over frozen slush as I pulled up outside Dana Whitlock's law office, a modest brick building tucked between a bakery and a marine supply shop. Inside, the air was warm, but it carried the scent of paper and ink, documents, not comfort. Dana greeted me with the calm of someone who had seen families torn apart by signatures before. Her presence steadied me, though my hand still shook when I laid everything out. The debts, Malcolm's sudden generosity, Lucas's warning from the bar. She didn't interrupt. She listened, eyes sharp, taking in every fracture of the story, until at last she leaned forward and said plainly, "A forged power of attorney is already in motion. If we don't act immediately, the county could record a deed before you even know it exists." The words hit me harder than any winter gale. My father wasn't just scheming. He was already moving against me. From that moment, everything became strategy. Dana drafted the paperwork that transferred the cottage into an irrevocable trust, naming me as both lifetime beneficiary and trustee. I signed each page with deliberate strokes, aware that every letter of my name was a wall rising between Malcolm and what he thought was his prize. She also prepared a fraud alert affidavit for the Knox County Registry of Deeds. "It's like a tripwire," she explained. "If he tries to slip forged documents through, it will trigger a review. They won't get past unnoticed." When I stepped back out into the Rockland air, the cold bit my skin, but this time it carried something else with it. Certainty. For the first time, I felt like I had drawn a line Malcolm could not cross. Back at the cottage, preparation became my only language. I hid cameras in corners of the rooms Malcolm once walked freely, a tiny lens above the doorway, another tucked into the kitchen rafters, one in the office where he liked to spread out papers when he pretended to be a businessman. Their red lights blinked softly, tiny beacons of my resolve. Meanwhile, Dana connected me with a handwriting analyst in Portland. I dug through boxes of old papers, my mother's will, insurance forms, tax returns, all bearing my genuine signature. Side by side with the forged documents Malcolm had filed, the fraud screamed through the ink. My hand carried weight and memory. His imitations carried nothing but shallow loops and uneven pressure. Then came the money trail. Dana traced the buyer's account and found it tied to Eddie Mullen, one of Malcolm's poker companions from Warren. I remembered Eddie from barbecues in my childhood, laughed too loud, hands always near the cash box. Now, money shifted between Malcolm and Eddie in restless patterns. Small deposits, sudden withdrawals, gaps that spoke of desperation rather than business. The web was unravelling. Late one evening, the phone rang. It was Marta Blair, a clerk at the Registry of Deeds, her voice hushed but firm. "We flagged a packet that came through after hours," she said. "Signatures looked rushed, almost panicked. Don't worry, I'll make sure nothing slips past us." Her words gave me a quiet kind of courage, the knowledge that not all battles had to be fought alone. Still, when Lucas offered to come by, to help with the cameras or simply sit with me in the silence, I told him no. I convinced myself that company was risk, that control was safety. His sigh on the other end of the line was soft but heavy, a disappointment that lingered long after I hung up. And so, I waited alone in the cottage, the cameras watching with me, knowing that the storm was only beginning to form. The invitation came on a Wednesday evening. Malcolm's voice on the phone carried a strange cheer, the kind of rehearsed brightness that cracked at the edges. "Ilara," he said, "let's have dinner, just you and me, the Summit Grill, Friday night. We'll toast to new beginnings." I knew better. It wasn't dinner he wanted. It was a stage. The Summit Grill sat on Rockland's waterfront, its windows stretching wide to frame the breakwater and the lighthouse beyond. A place for celebrations, for people who wanted their triumphs reflected in glass and sea. When I walked in, he was already seated at a corner table, a bottle of wine chilling in its bucket, menus spread out as though props in a performance. "Sit down, sweetheart," Malcolm said, his smile broad. "Tonight's a night for goodbyes, but also for beginnings. You'll see." I folded the napkin across my lap, forcing my hands to stay still. He poured 2 glasses of wine, raising his in a toast. "To your freedom," he declared. "No more dragging that old house like a ball and chain. I've lifted the weight for you." I let my glass touch his, but didn't drink. He leaned back, satisfaction lighting his face, his words slick as oil. "You should be thanking me. 3 million isn't a bad price. I've secured our future, and the 12,000, that's my way of making sure you land on your feet." Future. He said it as if cutting me out of my own life was some kind of legacy. I smiled faintly, letting him mistake it for surrender. He rambled on, emboldened by his own story, until a shadow fell across the table. "Ilara?" a familiar voice said with polite surprise. Dana Whitlock stood there, her leather bag slung over one shoulder. "I didn't expect to see you here." Malcolm's brows lifted, but he gestured grandly to the empty chair. "Join us," he said. He still thought he held every card. The waiter cleared our plates, and the wine loosened Malcolm's tongue. His voice dropped, carrying a raw bitterness. "You know, Ilara," he muttered, "your mother always favoured you. Even her will. She left you everything. That house should have been mine by rights. I built the dock, repaired the roof, paid taxes when she couldn't. And what did I get? Nothing. Judge just handed it all to you like I was an afterthought." I studied him carefully. Beneath his swagger lay the wound that had driven every scheme. He wasn't just trying to sell the cottage. He was trying to erase the insult he thought my mother had carved into stone. Dana caught my eye and gave the smallest nod. It was time. She leaned forward, her voice calm, almost conversational. "Malcolm, I happened to stop by the registry this week. Interesting timing on some documents filed under your name." His fork froze halfway to his mouth. What documents? Dana slid a folder across the table. Inside were copies of the trust filings, each page stamped and dated 3 days earlier. This cottage, she said evenly, is no longer vulnerable. It belongs to an irrevocable trust with Alara as lifetime beneficiary. Any deed you attempted afterward is void. His face darkened. He rifled through the pages, disbelief twisting his mouth. You can't do this to me. I already had a buyer. The so-called buyer, Dana continued, is tied to a shell account in Warren, one linked directly to your poker companion, Eddie Mullen. No funds cleared escrow. If you claimed otherwise, that qualifies as fraud. He slammed the folder shut. I poured years into that property, paid bills when your mother couldn't. Alara owes me. The words burned, but I held my composure. I don't owe you theft. Malcolm leaned closer, his voice dropping, desperate now. You don't understand. I'm drowning. Men are after me. Creditors, collectors. Selling that place was my way out. Without it, I'm finished. Dana's tone hardened, cutting through his plea. And forging a signature, exploiting your own daughter. Under Maine law, that's document fraud, attempted theft by deception, and financial exploitation of a family member. The district attorney could press charges tomorrow. For the first time, his swagger faltered. His eyes darted toward the window, where the lighthouse blinked in the darkening sky, as if searching for escape. Then he straightened, summoning the last of his defiance. So, what now? You going to drag me off in handcuffs? Not yet, Dana replied coldly. But prosecutors often weigh restitution. If you begin repayment, if you cooperate, it may alter how charges are pursued. Make no mistake, Malcolm, the clock has already started. Silence settled over the table, thick and unforgiving. He shifted in his chair, suddenly smaller than I had ever seen him. This wasn't a dinner anymore. It was a reckoning. The morning after that dinner, I drove back to Dana's office. The tide was still low along the Rockland shore, the smell of salt and rot heavy in the air. On Dana's desk lay the folder from last night, its pages marked with yellow tabs like silent verdicts. She looked at me across the polished wood, her expression unreadable but steady. What do you want to happen, Alara? She asked. Her voice was soft, but it carried weight. Do you want this handled quietly, or do you want to see him prosecuted? I stared at the trust certificate, at my signature in thick black ink. My throat tightened. I don't want this swept under the rug, but I don't want to watch him in an orange jumpsuit either. Not if there's another way. Dana nodded slowly, already pulling a new legal pad toward her. Then we'll initiate civil action, not to punish, but to hold leverage. He'll have to agree to restitution from whatever assets he can liquidate. He'll attend mandatory financial counselling. And most importantly, he'll sign a covenant forbidding him from contacting you about the property or interfering with the trust again. One violation and the criminal charges proceed. It sounded clinical, almost merciful. But my chest still felt heavy, as though I had just traded one burden for another. That night, I met Lucas at a cafe in Camden. He listened quietly as I laid out the plan. When I finished, he set his mug down with a frown. Do you realise what this will do to him? He asked. He'll say you're destroying him, not saving him. I leaned back, weary. Maybe both are true, but I can't ignore what he tried to do. If I let this slide, he'll just try again. This way, I stay safe. Lucas sighed, pressing his lips together before finally nodding. If this is what keeps you safe, I'll stand with you. It was a fragile kind of peace, one that steadied me, but didn't comfort me. When I returned to the cottage, I changed the locks. The new brass gleamed against the old pine doors, a sharp reminder that boundaries can be physical as well as legal. Each turn of the wrench felt like a declaration. "You will not walk freely here again." But safety alone wasn't enough. I needed something to build. So, with Dana's guidance, I created a small grant through a local land trust, funds dedicated to helping homeowners protect themselves from deed fraud. The applications arrived faster than I expected. People with stories too familiar, signatures questioned, neighbours coerced, families betrayed by blood. For the first time in months, my vigilance wasn't only about defence, it became construction, laying bricks for something larger than myself. Still, late at night, I couldn't silence the gnawing fear that I had set in motion something irreversible. I would pace the floorboards I had once sanded smooth, listening to the winter wind press against the glass. I thought about my father in some small rented room, blaming me for every downfall. And then, one morning, a plain envelope arrived in the mail. The handwriting on it was Malcolm's. Sharp, impatient strokes I'd known my whole life. No excuses inside, no apologies. Just a single line. I only asked to stand by the road and look at the cottage once more. I carried the letter to the granite steps by the lake, where my mother once sat with her morning coffee. The request was modest compared to the harm he had done, but it unsettled me more than any threat. It took me 3 days to decide, and when I did, it was with one condition: he could come, but only as far as the gravel shoulder beyond the gate. The day Malcolm came to the gate, the lake was restless, its surface broken by a cold autumn wind that carried the smell of pine and damp leaves. I stood on the porch, hidden behind the birches, and watched as he parked his truck at the shoulder. He didn't step forward. He didn't call out my name. He simply stood there, hands shoved deep into his coat pockets, staring at the cottage as though it were a ghost. The roofline, the stone chimney, the way the birch trees bent toward the water. He looked at it all like a man surveying something he had once claimed but never truly owned. For the first time, his silence wasn't a tactic. It was the closest thing to respect I had ever received from him. And yet, standing there, my emotions tangled like roots under the frost. Part of me wanted to scream at him for what he'd tried to steal, for the way he laughed in that bar as though I were nothing but a fool to be played. Another part of me felt a sharp pang of grief, not for him, but for the father he might have been if greed hadn't hollowed him out. He stayed only a few minutes. Then, without a word, he turned back to his truck, started the engine, and drove away. His taillights vanished down the road, swallowed by the shadows of the pines. That night, I sat by the wood stove, the flames casting restless patterns across the cottage walls. The silence was different now, not heavy, not suffocating, just quiet. For the first time in years, I realized the house wasn't trembling under the weight of his schemes. It was breathing with me. Weeks passed. True to Dana's framework, Malcolm began restitution. The payments were small, sometimes no more than a few $100s clipped from the wages he earned repairing boats in Owl's Head, but they came steadily. Dana tracked every receipt, each one placed into a growing file that proved accountability mattered more than his promises ever had. Lucas kept close, visiting on weekends, helping me with shoreline work. We planted low stone buffers and native shrubs to guard against erosion, each project a reminder that defences could be built, slowly, piece by piece. Sometimes, in the quiet of late afternoons, Lucas would look at me and ask softly, "Do you think he'll ever change?" I never answered, because I knew change wasn't the point anymore. Survival was, but survival has its own cost. One evening, as Dana and I reviewed the restitution file, I admitted the truth I had avoided naming. The more I tighten things, the locks, the trust, the cameras, the more alone I feel, as if safety has become a cage. Dana closed the file gently. Boundaries protect you, she said, "but if you never open the gate, they can trap you just as easily as they shield you." Her words stayed with me long after she left. That night, I dreamed of my mother. She was on the cottage steps, humming the old tune she used to sing when she cooked Sunday dinners. She didn't speak, but her eyes seemed to ask me the same question Dina had, whether I would let these walls keep me safe or let them keep me alone. By late summer, Camden was alive again. Farmers' markets brimming with blueberries, tourists crowding the harbour, music drifting across the park. Life moved on, untouched by my private wars. I walked those streets with the knowledge that my story had bent, but not broken me. Still, every time the phone rang, I wondered if Malcolm's shadow was waiting on the other end. A year passed, not in triumph, but in slow, deliberate steps. Each month, Dana sent me updates. Malcolm's partial payments logged, his attendance at counselling sessions confirmed, his grudging compliance noted in tidy legal language. None of it erased the betrayal. But it carved out a rhythm, steady, measurable, and impossible for him to wriggle free from. For once in my life, Malcolm's promises were backed not by his word, but by consequence. And yet, his presence lingered like a ghost. He no longer crossed the gate, no longer called my phone, but I felt him outside the boundary. A shadow in town, a rumour whispered in the marina bars. I learned to live with it the way one lives with the knowledge of winter. It would always come, but I had built enough walls to survive it. Inside the cottage, I claimed the space as my own, in ways I had never dared before. I prepared a shadow box for the mantle, carefully placing 3 artefacts within it. The steel key I had once worn around my neck, the trust certificate stamped with Dana's filing seal, and a photograph my mother had taken of the cottage the summer before she died. Together, they formed a silent testimony to what was nearly stolen, to what endured, to what I had reclaimed. The key no longer needed to rest against my skin. It belonged behind glass now, no longer a talisman of fear, but an artifact of survival. One crisp September evening, Lucas joined me on the porch. We drank coffee as the lake reflected the fiery maples of early autumn. He leaned back in his chair, studying the water. "You know," he said quietly, "I think this place looks stronger now than it ever did, like it's grown with you." I nodded, unable to find words. Because he was right. The cottage no longer carried the sound of betrayal in its bones. It carried my labour, my boundaries, my endurance. But the world beyond these walls hadn't stopped moving. My grant programme through the Land Trust gained momentum, applications arriving from people whose stories mirrored mine too closely. A widow in Thomaston tricked by her own nephew. A retired couple in Belfast nearly losing their farmhouse to forged deeds. For the first time in years, I wasn't only defending myself, I was building a shield for others. My vigilance had turned outward, transforming pain into protection. Still, Malcolm's shadow reached for me now and then. He wrote another letter, short, bitter, resentful. In it, he accused me of being poisoned against him, of siding with strangers over blood. He signed it, "Your father," as if the word itself still bound me. I folded the letter, placed it in the file with his receipts, and closed the drawer. His voice would not define me anymore. By late October, the air grew sharp, the first frost clinging to the pines. I stood in the doorway of the cottage one morning, watching mist roll across the lake, and realised something with a calm finality. Malcolm's story no longer dictated mine. He was still out there, circling in his own storm, but he remained outside the gate. The cottage, at last, was mine, uncontested, unshaken, and alive with the quiet rhythm of survival. And for the first time since my mother's death, I felt not just endurance, but freedom.